She gave a home to 3 forgotten boys. Years later, they returned as heroes. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, and Dorothea Calloway almost did not pick up the phone. She was standing in her kitchen, pressing the wrinkles out of a tablecloth she had already ironed twice that week, when the landline rang. She looked at it for a moment the way a person looks at something they're not sure they want, then she picked it up. The woman on the other end worked for the county. She spoke in the calm, practiced way that people use when they deliver news that is not calm at all. She said there were 3 boys. She said the beds lined up. She said it would be a short-term placement, most likely. She said most likely the way people say it when they already know better. Dorothea was 63 years old. She had been a school teacher for 31 years. She had buried her husband, Lawrence, 4 years earlier, and she had spent the time since then learning how to fill a house that kept getting quieter. She had 3 bedrooms. She had a garden that produced more tomatoes than one person could ever eat. She had a pot of stew on the stove that she made every Sunday, large enough to feed a family, even though she had no family left to feed. She said yes before the woman finished explaining. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and thought about what she had just agreed to, and somewhere around 2 in the morning she got up, went to the kitchen, and started cooking. It was the only thing she knew how to do when she was frightened. The boys arrived on a Saturday morning in early March. A caseworker named Gloria brought them in a gray sedan, and they came through the front door the way boys come through doors when they have learned not to expect anything good on the other side. The oldest was 11. His name was Caleb. He was thin and serious, with eyes that watched everything at once, and he carried a single grocery bag that held everything he owned. He stood in Dorothea's living room and looked around slowly, the way a person inspects a place for exits. The middle boy was 9. His name was Marcus. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow and the kind of restless energy that comes not from joy but from years of never feeling safe enough to sit still. He did not stop moving for the entire first hour. He touched the walls, opened the cabinet under the sink, checked whether the windows could be opened from the inside. The youngest was 7. His name was Deshawn. He did not speak, not a word. He stood behind Caleb the entire time, one hand gripping the back of Caleb's jacket, and he watched Dorothea with enormous, unreadable eyes. Gloria, the caseworker, explained their histories in the clipped, careful language of official reports. Marcus had been found in a house where the electricity had not worked in 2 years. Deshawn had been in 3 different placements in the last 18 months. Caleb had at some point become the person responsible for making sure both younger boys ate, which was why he had learned to cook, which was why, when Dorothea showed him the kitchen, something shifted very slightly in his face. Not a smile, something quieter than a smile, recognition. After Gloria left, Dorothea did not give a speech. She did not sit them down and explain her rules or her expectations. She went to the stove, filled 3 bowls with the stew she had made at 2 in the morning, set them on the table, and said the only thing she could think of. "Come eat." They sat down, they ate without looking up. She refilled the bowls without being asked. Outside, the March wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard, and the kitchen was warm, and for a few minutes the only sound was spoons against bowls and the quiet work of 3 starving children eating their first real meal in longer than any of them could say. That night she made up the 3 beds with the good sheets. She put a glass of water on each nightstand. She left the hall light on. None of it was extraordinary, that was the point. She understood in the way that only certain people understand that what these boys needed was not extraordinary. What they needed was ordinary, delivered consistently, without conditions. A warm bowl, a light in the hall, a door that opened the same way every morning. She had been a teacher long enough to know that children who have been let down do not trust words. They trust repetition. They trust the pot on the stove and the iron tablecloth and the alarm that goes off at the same time every day. They trust the evidence, so she gave them evidence. The first week was hard. Marcus broke a lamp on Tuesday, not out of anger, but out of the nervous energy that lived in his hands, and he went completely still afterward, braced for something. Dorothea looked at the lamp for a moment, then looked at him, and said that she had never liked that lamp anyway, which was not entirely true, but was the right thing to say. She swept it up herself and went back to the kitchen. Deshawn woke up twice that first week, making sounds in his sleep that Dorothea heard through the walls. She did not go in. She had learned from years of teaching that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a child is let them find their way back on their own, but she left the hall light on a little brighter. Caleb did not cause problems. Caleb never caused problems. That in itself was the problem. He was too careful, too controlled, too good at making himself invisible. He folded his clothes with a precision that no 11-year-old should have, as though he had always been prepared to pack them again at any moment. He ate every meal without complaint and helped clean up without being asked and said please and thank you with a consistency that broke Dorothea's heart quietly and repeatedly. On the 8th day, she handed him a dish towel and stood beside him at the sink, and while they washed the dinner dishes together, she told him that he did not have to be perfect here, that nothing good in this house would disappear because he made a mistake, that the stew would be there tomorrow whether he was perfect or not. He did not respond. He kept drying the dish in his hands. But the next morning, for the first time, he left his shoes in the middle of the hallway instead of lined up neatly by the door. She stepped over them and said nothing and felt something loosen in her chest. The neighbors watched with interest. The woman 2 doors down, a perfectly pleasant person named Harriet, came over with a casserole in the second week and spent most of the visit looking at the boys with an expression that was almost but not quite concern. She said more than once that Dorothea was very brave. Dorothea thanked her for the casserole and did not engage with the bravery. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as a woman with 3 empty bedrooms and a pot that was always big enough. That was all. That was everything. By the end of the first month, the house had changed in ways she had not anticipated. It was louder. Things were misplaced. The good towels ended up in the wrong bathroom. Marcus left a trail of crumbs that she followed like a map from the kitchen to wherever he had decided to eat his snack that day. Deshawn, still silent, began to appear at her elbow while she cooked, watching everything she did with quiet, focused attention. She started narrating what she was doing, not for any deliberate therapeutic reason, just because the silence felt like something that wanted filling, and she had always talked while she cooked. She said things like, "Now we add the garlic because the garlic is what makes it honest, and you let it simmer because the best things take time," and she never once looked over to check whether he was listening. She just talked, and he just stood there, and that was enough for both of them. Spring came slowly that year, the way spring comes in places where winter has decided it owns the month of March. Dorothea had a garden in the backyard, beds of vegetables, and a long stretch of dark soil that had not been turned yet. One afternoon, she went out with a shovel and found Marcus sitting on the back steps, watching her. She handed him the shovel without explanation. She pointed at the nearest bed. He looked at the shovel, he looked at the dirt. He put the shovel in and turned the first clod of earth, and something in his face opened up in a way she had not seen before, something between surprise and relief, as though he had not known that the ground would give if you pushed hard enough. They worked until the light went. She did not praise him excessively. She just pointed to what needed doing and worked beside him, and by the time they went inside, his hands were filthy and he was the calmest she had ever seen him. He was in that garden every day after that. The county called every few weeks. There was paperwork. There were visits from Gloria, who sat on the sofa and asked the boys questions in a gentle, professional voice and wrote things on a clipboard. There were forms about education and medical care and emotional development, and Dorothea filled them all out at the kitchen table at night after the boys were in bed, reading glasses on, handwriting neat and precise, a cup of tea going cold beside her. She never found the paperwork burdensome. She found it clarifying. Every form she filled out was a record. Evidence that these 3 boys existed, that they were being seen, that someone was counting them. By the end of that first spring, Marcus had memorized the names of every plant in the garden. Deshawn had started pointing at things he wanted instead of going without. Caleb had left his shoes in the hallway 7 more times. And Dorothea Calloway, who had answered the phone on a Thursday afternoon not knowing what she was agreeing to, had begun to understand that the table she had been setting for nobody had, in fact, been set for exactly the right people all along. It was just that they needed a little time to find their way to it. It was a Tuesday in October when Deshawn laughed for the first time. Dorothea had been baking cornbread, which she had made so many times over the course of her life that she could do it in her sleep, which was perhaps why she was not paying attention when the smell of burning crept into the kitchen. She grabbed the pan, felt the heat, and let out a small, startled word under her breath. Just one word, not a terrible word, just the kind that escapes when a person is caught off guard. She heard it before she saw it, a sound she did not immediately recognize because she had never heard it before. Then she turned and there was Deshawn, bent nearly double, holding his own ribs, laughing so hard that no sound was coming out anymore, just the shaking. She stood there with the burned cornbread and watched him, and something moved through her chest that she could not have named and did not try to. She burned the cornbread the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. She told no one it was on purpose. She let Deshawn believe she was simply a woman who had a complicated relationship with baking, and every time without fail that laugh came loose, a little easier, a little louder, until by December it was a sound she heard every single day and had come to think of as the sound the house made when it was working properly. He started talking in November, not to everyone, first just to her and only in the kitchen and only about small things. He said things like, "That smells good and can I try?" Then he started talking to Marcus, who was so thrilled he did not know what to do with himself, and responded by talking so much that Deshawn sometimes held up a hand and said, "Okay, enough," which made Marcus laugh and made Caleb look up from whatever he was reading with something that was almost a smile. Caleb was a reader. Dorothea had not known this at first because he hid the books the way some children hide food, tucking them under mattresses and behind other things, as though he expected someone to take them. When she figured it out, she drove to the library on a Saturday morning and got him a card in his name, and she handed it to him at breakfast without ceremony, just slid it across the table beside his orange juice, and he picked it up and turned it over in his hands and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I can take out as many as I want." She said, "That is the general idea, yes." He went to the library that same afternoon and came home with 9 books and the expression of a person who has just discovered that a door they had always believed was locked was actually open. School was its own complicated territory. Marcus was bright but scattered, a boy whose mind moved faster than the structure of a classroom could hold. He got into trouble not from cruelty but from restlessness, and more than once Dorothea sat across a desk from a teacher or a principal and listened to descriptions of Marcus that sounded nothing like the boy she knew. She said this calmly each time. She said, "I understand he is difficult to manage in a group setting, but I want you to understand what he is capable of when someone gives him something real to do with his hands and his mind." She said it without anger, and she kept saying it, and she kept showing up. She showed up so consistently and so calmly that the school eventually stopped treating her appearances as problems to be managed and started treating them as resources to be used. They called her now when Marcus was struggling, not after the fact, and that made all the difference. Deshawn's silence at school confused his teachers in ways that Deshawn could not always explain. He was not disruptive. He was not difficult. He was simply quiet in a way that adults found unnerving, a stillness that they sometimes mistook for absence, as though a child who did not speak loudly must not be thinking deeply. Dorothea went to the school and sat with his teacher and said, "Watch what he does when he is given something to observe rather than something to perform." The teacher watched. Deshawn, given a science experiment to document by drawing rather than writing, produced 6 pages of illustrations so precise and so detailed that the teacher kept them and referred to them all year. Caleb needed the least intervention and the most patience, which is a particular kind of challenge. He was exceptional in ways that the school recognized and rewarded, but recognition, Dorothea had come to understand, can sometimes be another pressure wearing a better outfit. She watched him carefully for signs of the weight he had always carried, the weight of being the responsible one, the capable one, the one who held things together. She did not take the weight away. She could not. It was part of him by then. But she tried, whenever she could, to make sure he also knew how to put it down. On a cold Saturday in January of that first year, nearly 10 months in, Caleb found her in the garden, which was bare now and waiting for spring. He stood beside her for a while, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the empty beds. He said, "Why do you do this?" She did not pretend to misunderstand the question. She thought about it for a moment. She looked at the bare earth and the oak tree and the house behind them with the lights on in the kitchen. Then she said, "Because somebody should have done it sooner." He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that she thought maybe he was done, that the conversation had ended the way conversations sometimes end between people who understand each other well enough not to need to fill the silence. Then he said, "Do you mean for us or in general?" She said, "Both, always both." He nodded once slowly, then he went back inside. That evening he set the table for dinner without being asked. He did this every evening for the rest of the time he lived in her house, and he never mentioned the conversation in the garden again, and neither did she, and it remained between them understood. The second year brought new challenges and new ground. Gloria, the caseworker, began the process of discussing long-term placement options. The language around this was careful and measured, but what it meant was that the boys were not going back to where they had come from. What it meant was that the question of where they would go next needed an answer. Dorothea answered it without drama. She said she would continue as long as the boys needed to be there. She signed the extended paperwork. She kept the hall light on. There was a period that spring when Marcus went through something that she could not entirely reach him through. He grew quieter, which on him looked wrong, the way quiet looks wrong on a body built for motion. He spent more time in the garden, alone, digging with a focus that was less about the garden than about something he needed to do with his hands so that he did not do something else. She did not push. She planted things beside him and let the quiet sit between them without trying to fix it. One afternoon, he looked up from the soil and said, "My mom used to have plants." He said it the way you say something you have been carrying in your back teeth for a long time. She did not ask questions. She said she must have known something good. He looked at the plant in his hands for a while. Then he put it in the earth and pressed the soil around it carefully, like he was tucking something in. He was a little easier after that, not fixed. There is no fixed, but easier. Deshaun, in his second year, began to draw everything. The kitchen, the garden, the oak tree, Caleb's shoes in the hallway, the cornbread on the table, Marcus's hands in the dirt. He filled notebooks that Dorothea bought him steadily, saying nothing about the cost, understanding that this was how he processed the world, this was his language, and language should never be rationed. The drawings were extraordinary. She did not use that word lightly. She was a woman who had spent 31 years surrounded by children, and she knew the difference between encouraging work and genuinely extraordinary work. Deshaun's drawings had a quality of attention that was almost uncomfortable, a precision about the way light fell on ordinary things, a way of seeing that made the viewer feel they had been looking at the world incorrectly this whole time. She framed 3 of them and put them on the kitchen wall. He saw them one morning before school and stopped in front of them for a long time without saying anything. Then he sat down at the table and ate his breakfast and went to school. That afternoon, he came home and made her a drawing of her own hands holding her tea mug and left it on her pillow without a note. It is still the truest picture anyone has ever made of her. The years layered, the boys grew. Caleb shot up over the summer before 8th grade and came downstairs one morning taller than Dorothea, which neither of them mentioned but both of them noticed. Marcus became obsessed with understanding how things grew, not just in the garden but in the scientific sense, the biology of growth, why certain conditions produced certain results. He started bringing home library books about soil composition and plant biology, and Dorothea, who had a degree in education and a mind that had never fully retired, talked through the ideas with him over dinner in a way that looked like conversation but was actually carefully school. Deshaun spoke more each year. He was never loud. He was never the talker that Marcus was. But he had a particular way of saying true things at unexpected moments, a quiet precision that could stop a room. Once, during a dinner table argument between Marcus and Caleb about something neither of them could remember afterward, Deshaun looked up from his plate and said, "You both know you are right and you are both also wrong, and it is okay for 2 things to be true." Then he went back to eating. The argument stopped. Dorothea looked at this 7-year-old who was not 7 anymore and felt, not for the first time, that she was the one being taught. She kept a corkboard in the kitchen. It had started with their school schedules and lunch menus and reminders about library books. Over the years, it filled with other things: a drawing Marcus made of the garden in bloom, a certificate from Caleb's school for an essay competition he had won, a small card Deshaun made from folded notebook paper that said, on the outside for Dorothea and on the inside, "Thank you for the cornbread, even the burned kind." She kept the cards, she kept everything. The caseworkers changed twice over those years. New faces, new clipboards, the same questions asked in slightly different orders. Dorothea answered them all. She did not find the process intrusive. She understood that the system was imperfect, but that the people inside it, most of them, were trying. She treated them with the same patient, attentive courtesy she had given her students, and they responded, most of them, by being more careful with the boys than they might otherwise have been. There were difficult moments that did not resolve neatly, the way difficult moments rarely do. There were phone calls at night that left Dorothea standing in the dark kitchen for a long time before she went back to bed. There were meetings she drove to alone and sat through alone and drove home from alone. There were forms that asked for things she could not always provide, and she learned slowly where the gaps were and how to navigate around them. She never once considered stopping. She had answered the phone on a Thursday afternoon because something in her understood that the table was set and the house was warm and the pot was big enough. 3 years in, she understood something more specific. She was not doing these boys a favor. She was doing what any person with a warm house and a working stove and any decent amount of sense should have been doing all along. She was just the one who happened to pick up the phone. That distinction mattered to her. It kept her from feeling like a hero. Heroes are singular. Heroes are remarkable. What she was doing was not remarkable. It was simply necessary, and it was possible, and she was able to do it. So she did. Year 3 ended with Caleb winning a regional science competition for a structural design project that his teacher described as the kind of work she expected from students 3 grades ahead of him. He came home with a blue ribbon and a certificate and an expression of careful, controlled pride, the expression of someone who has wanted something for a long time and is not yet sure he is allowed to have it. Dorothea put the ribbon on the corkboard. She put it right in the center where everyone could see it, and she left room around it deliberately for everything that was going to come next. The summer before Caleb turned 14, he started talking about engineering. Not the casual way that boys talk about things they think sound interesting, the specific way. He had been reading about bridges, about the mathematics of load and tension, about the way structures are designed to hold weight without breaking. He had filled an entire notebook with calculations that Dorothea could not follow and would not pretend to, but she sat across from him at the kitchen table on many evenings while he worked through them, and she asked questions and he explained, and she listened with the full, focused attention she had given her students for 31 years. He needed someone to aim at, she understood this. Some children find their direction early and just need a clear space to move through it without being stopped. She cleared the space. She called the public library and found out about programs for students interested in mathematics and design. She drove Caleb to a summer workshop at the State University, 53 miles each way, 3 Saturdays in a row. She waited in the parking lot with a book and a thermos of tea, and when he came out each time, she did not ask how it went because she could see it in how he walked, straight, like something had lined up. The other 2 were finding their shapes as well, more slowly, through less obvious channels. Marcus had developed, over years of garden work and late-night reading, something that looked from the outside like stubbornness but was actually a very precise form of loyalty. He was loyal to facts. He was loyal to what he could see and touch and prove. He did not accept explanations that were vague or dismissive, and this quality, which had made him difficult to manage in classrooms where the priority was compliance, made him exceptional in settings where the priority was accuracy. He had started volunteering on weekends at a community center not far from Dorothea's house, working with younger children on garden projects. He was 15. The younger children listened to him with a seriousness that was almost comic, these 6- and 7-year-olds nodding solemnly while Marcus explained the difference between clay soil and sandy soil, holding up handfuls of earth and narrating with the authority of someone who had spent years learning something real through his hands. Dorothea went to watch once. She sat on a bench at the edge of the garden area and watched Marcus move through those children with a patience and a precision that she recognized, because she had spent 31 years practicing it herself. She did not tell him that. She went home and added a note to the corkboard, Marcus Garden Program, Saturday mornings. Deshawn was 13 and still drawing, but the drawings had changed. They were larger now, more ambitious, and they had begun to move beyond the documentation of specific things, the kitchen, the garden, the faces of people he knew, into something harder to describe. He was drawing emotional states, abstract but not arbitrary. A drawing he made after a difficult week at school showed a figure standing in the center of a page, surrounded by lines that radiated outward in all directions, and every line was slightly different in weight and direction, and the effect was not of chaos but of a person holding steady against enormous pressure, a person who was being pulled in many directions and was still standing. He left it on the kitchen table one morning without explanation. Dorothea looked at it for a long time before she went to wake them up for school. High school arrived for all 3 of them in succession and brought with it the particular complications of that age. Marcus discovered that the things he had learned to care about, precision, evidence, the slow and honest work of growing something from the ground, were not always the things that made a 15-year-old socially comfortable. He had a difficult year socially, though he never quite framed it that way. He came home quieter than usual on certain evenings, and Dorothea fed him and left the space open and did not press. Once he said, "Some people think I am weird." She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Most people who are good at something real are considered weird by people who are not yet good at anything. It is usually temporary." He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. Then he said, "Is it weird that I find soil composition genuinely interesting?" She said deeply, "Yes, also irrelevant." He smiled. It took a second, but it got there. Caleb at 15 was beginning to attract the kind of academic attention that institutions pay to students they have identified as valuable. His math teacher recommended him for an accelerated program. His science teacher entered his work in competitions without asking him first, which annoyed him, and then he won, which complicated his annoyance. a guidance counselor began talking about college, about scholarships, about programs for students with demonstrated aptitude in technical fields. Dorothea sat in on these meetings. She sat beside Caleb and said very little because Caleb did not need her to speak for him, he needed her to be in the room. She understood the difference. She had made a career of knowing the difference. After one of these meetings, walking back to the car, Caleb said, "They talk about college like it is inevitable." She said, "Is that a problem?" He thought for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know if I know how to want something that far away." She did not rush the answer. They got in the car. She started the engine. Then she said, "You have been planning things far away your whole life. You just called it other things." He looked out the window for the rest of the drive and did not speak. But when they got home, he went straight to his room, and she heard, through the wall, the sound of pencil on paper, the same sound she had heard 100 times before when something in him needed to be worked out through his hands. Deshawn at 14 began seeing a school counselor. This was not Dorothea's idea. It was Deshawn's, which is the only reason it worked. He had asked her one evening while she was making tea whether she thought it was strange to want to talk to someone professional about things. She had said no, she thought it was one of the most sensible things a person could want. He had nodded and said okay, and the following week he made the appointment himself. The counselor's name was Patricia, and she was a careful, thoughtful woman who told Dorothea, in a meeting they had separately, that Deshawn had one of the most developed emotional intelligences she had seen in a student his age. She said he had found in drawing a language that was doing real psychological work, that his ability to translate feeling into image was not just a talent but a coping mechanism of unusual sophistication. Dorothea thanked her and went home and made note of it privately, in the way she noted all things that mattered, without show and without excess, just a quiet, steady acknowledgement that something true had been said. The years of high school moved the way years move when they are full, faster than they seem while you are in them, slower when you look back. There were milestones and ordinary days and the occasional crisis that resolved and the occasional one that didn't, not fully, not cleanly, because that is the nature of real life. Caleb won 3 more academic competitions. He was given an award at his school's end-of-year ceremony and gave a short speech that was precise and specific and notably free of the kind of empty gratitude that filled such speeches. He thanked Dorothea by name. He said, "I had someone who showed me what it looks like when a person decides something matters and does not change their mind." He said it once, without embellishment, and sat back down. She was in the 3rd row. She did not cry, which she considered a personal achievement. Marcus found, in the 2nd year of high school, a biology teacher named Mr. Aldridge who took him seriously in a way that changed things. Mr. Aldridge assigned Marcus an independent study project and gave him real latitude in choosing the topic and the method. Marcus spent 4 months studying the soil composition of abandoned urban lots and what would be needed to make them productive growing spaces. He produced a 40-page report with photographs and data tables and a proposed plan for converting 3 specific lots in the city into community gardens. Mr. Aldridge submitted it to a regional student research competition. Marcus came 3rd. He was disappointed for about a day. Then he started revising the proposal. Deshawn entered an art competition in his junior year and won 1st place in the regional division for a series of 5 drawings he called Visible Things, which were portraits of people he knew, drawn from the inside out, as though the viewer could see not just the face but the entire structure of what the person was made of. The judge's notes said the series demonstrated a level of psychological perception that was rare in any artist, not just in students. He showed Dorothea the notes one evening. She read them carefully. She gave them back. She said, "They are right." He said, "It feels like too much." She said, "That is often how the truth feels at first." The corkboard in the kitchen was running out of space. She had started a 2nd one. During these years, Dorothea was also aging, which she did with the same practical attention she brought to everything else. She went to her doctor regularly. She managed her blood pressure with medication and with the garden, which had always been her best medicine. She maintained her friendships, her church attendance, her weekly call to her sister in another state. She kept a life that was full and specifically hers, not dissolved into the lives of these 3 boys, but running alongside theirs, separate and sustaining. She understood that this was important. A woman who has no life outside her care cannot sustain the care. She had seen this happen to people. She was determined that it would not happen to her. There were evenings when the house was full and noisy, and she sat at the kitchen table with her tea and felt something she could only describe as rightness. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it, rightness, the sense that the shape of the moment matched the shape of something she had always been moving toward without knowing its name. There were also evenings when she sat at the same table after the boys were in bed and felt the weight of all of it, the paperwork and the meetings and the phone calls and the costs she covered quietly and the things she could not fix no matter how steady she remained. Those evenings she prayed, not for solutions but for the patience to keep going, which had always seemed to her the more honest prayer. She kept going. Caleb's senior year brought the scholarship, a full ride to a 4-year state university with an engineering program that ranked among the best in the region. He received the letter on a Wednesday afternoon and stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time without saying anything. She waited. Then he said, "I got in." She said, "I know." He looked up. "How?" She said, "I did not know about this specific letter. I knew about you." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He helped with dinner, he ate, he cleaned up. And at some point during the evening, in that quiet, particular way he had always had, he sat down next to her on the sofa and did not say anything, just sat there, and she did not say anything either, and they watched the evening news in silence, and that was the whole of the celebration, and it was enough. She packed his suitcase herself the weekend before he left. She folded everything with the care she had always brought to things that mattered. She added a jar of garden soil from the backyard, which she told him was for good luck. He took it without laughing. He understood her languages by now. The morning he left, Marcus and Deshawn were both at the door. Marcus shook his hand, then pulled him into a hug that went on longer than either of them probably planned. Deshawn said, "See you at Thanksgiving," in the matter-of-fact tone he used when he was feeling things he did not want to perform. Caleb nodded at both of them. He looked at Dorothea for a moment. She said, "Call me when you land." He said, "It is a 4-hour drive." She said, "Call me when you land." He called. She was in the garden when the phone rang. She picked it up and stood among the tomatoes and listened to his voice, steadier than it had ever been, and she said, "Good, go be where you are," and she hung up and went back to weeding because the weeds did not stop for occasion. The house did not go quiet this time. Not entirely. There were still 2 boys left, growing, changing, filling the rooms with their particular sounds and silences. But something shifted in the way a house shifts when a person who is always at its center moves on. You can still feel the shape of where they were. She ironed the tablecloth that evening. She made the pot of stew she had been making every Sunday for years, large enough to feed a family. Then she sat down and waited for the 2 who were still there to come to dinner. The table was set. It was always set. Deshawn turned 18 on a Thursday in February in his final year of high school. Dorothea made the cornbread perfectly that morning on purpose and said nothing about it, and watched him notice and say nothing back, and the 2 of them ate breakfast in the comfortable silence that had taken years to build and was now one of the best things in the house. His acceptance letters had started arriving in January. He opened them at the kitchen table one by one over the course of a week, and he did so with a quietness that was not about containing his feelings but about processing them carefully, which was how he had always done things. An arts program at a university 2 states over. A scholarship for students demonstrating exceptional work in visual art and design. A letter from the admissions office that included a personal note from a faculty member who had seen his regional competition entries and wanted to say, directly, that the work was unlike anything the department had seen from a first-year applicant in a long time. He read the faculty member's note twice. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept the things that mattered most to him: the card from Dorothea's birthday, the notes from Patricia the counselor from junior year, the photograph of all 3 of them in the garden from the summer Marcus was 16. Dorothea put the acceptance letter on the corkboard. The second corkboard was nearly full now. She was going to need a third. Marcus had 1 year left. He was 17 and had been carrying, for the past year, the particular weight of a young man who knows exactly what he wants to do and is not yet sure the world will let him. He wanted to work with communities. With the actual soil and actual people, not in a laboratory or behind a desk, but in the specific, tangible, difficult work of making neglected spaces productive and giving people access to the kind of growing and tending that had given him something real when he was 9 years old and terrified. He had been accepted to a community college program in environmental and agricultural science. He had also been offered, through Mr. Aldridge's continued advocacy, a small grant for a project proposal he had revised twice since coming third in the competition 2 years earlier. He showed Dorothea the grant letter in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. He sat across from her and slid it across the table and watched her read it. She read it carefully, she set it down, she looked at him. He said, "It is not a full scholarship." She said, "No." He said, "I know community college is not what Caleb did." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Caleb's path and your path are not the same path. They were never going to be. A bridge and a garden are both structures. They both hold things, they just hold different things." He took the letter back. He held it in both hands the way he held plants when he was deciding where they should go. He said, "I think I want to do something real." She said, "You have been doing something real since you were 9 years old," and put a shovel in the ground. He went out to the garden after that and was there for a long time, and she watched him through the kitchen window, this boy who was a man now, standing in the dirt he had been tending for 8 years, and she thought about the first afternoon she had handed him a shovel without explanation, and she thought about how much of life is just handing someone a shovel and trusting them to know what to do with it. She made tea and stayed by the window until he came back in. Deshawn left in August, which is the month universities tend to begin. Dorothea drove him, she had insisted. He had a trunk full of notebooks and art supplies, and the particular items that accumulate around a person over years, small and meaningful and hard to explain to anyone who does not already know the story. They drove mostly in silence, which was their native mode, and she played the radio low and he looked out the window at things passing, and somewhere in the last hour he said, "I am going to be okay." She said, "I know." He said, "How do you always know?" She said, "You have been okay for a long time. You just needed enough time to know it yourself." He thought about that for the rest of the drive. When they arrived, she helped him carry boxes up to his room, which was on the 3rd floor and smelled like new carpet and the particular combination of anxiety and possibility that clings to every dormitory in September. She made the bed. She organized the art supplies in a way that made sense. She put a small photograph of the 3 of them on his desk without asking. He looked at it for a while, then he said, "Thank you, not just for this." She said, "I know what you mean." She hugged him in the hallway outside his room, firmly and briefly, which was how both of them preferred it. She walked to the elevator, she pressed the button, she rode down to the lobby. She sat in her car for 6 minutes before she drove home. Marcus's last year was the fullest. He was running the garden program at the community center now, having grown from a volunteer into a kind of unofficial lead, the person the younger volunteers came to with questions, the person who showed up first and left last and always knew where the good soil amendments were stored. He was also finishing his application for a second grant, larger than the first, for a project he had been designing for a year, a proposal to convert a 1-acre abandoned lot in a low-income neighborhood into a working community garden that would grow food for distribution to local families. He worked on it at the kitchen table late at night, and Dorothea, who kept the same hours she always had, sat nearby and drank her tea and occasionally asked questions that she already knew the answers to, but understood would be useful for him to say out loud. He said once, late on a Tuesday, "I do not know if people will believe it can work." She said, "Which people?" He said, "The people making the grant decisions." She said, "You are not writing to convince them it can work. You are writing to show them that it already has. There is a difference." He looked up from the page. He said, "The garden here." She said, 8 years of evidence. Use it." He rewrote that section the following morning before school. The grant came through in March, not for the full amount, but for enough to start. He called Caleb that night. She heard his voice through the wall, rising with something he never let out in public, that particular joy of a person who has wanted something for so long that its arrival feels faintly unreal. She knocked on his door. He opened it still holding the phone, and she looked at him and she said, "Well." He said, "Well." She said, "Now what?" He grinned the way he had grinned since he was 9, that specific grin that arrived late but landed fully, and he said, "Now we build." His last weeks at home were both ordinary and not. She ironed his shirts. He maintained the garden. They had dinner at the same time every night, and she kept the stew pot full, and the house moved through its last days of having him in it with the same quiet attention it had always shown to the things that mattered most. His leaving was not dramatic, because nothing true ever is. He put his things in a borrowed truck on a Saturday morning in June. He had been accepted to a university program in the city that had offered him a scholarship specifically for students in applied environmental science with demonstrated community impact, which was a category that seemed to have been designed for someone exactly like him, which Dorothea suspected was not an accident. He hugged her in the driveway for a long time. She said, "Call me." He said, "I know." He drove away. She stood in the driveway until the truck was gone. Then she went inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at the corkboard, which was now 3 boards lined up along the wall, covered in 12 years of evidence. She made tea. She went to the kitchen window. The garden was in full bloom. She thought about a woman standing in that kitchen in the dark at 2 in the morning, making stew for 3 boys she had not yet met, following some instinct she could not entirely name. She thought about a caseworker named Gloria and a landline phone ringing on a Thursday afternoon and a tablecloth she had ironed twice already. She thought about a 7-year-old who had stood behind his older brother's jacket and not spoken a word. She thought about a 9-year-old putting his hands in the dirt for the first time and discovering that the ground gives if you push hard enough. She thought about an 11-year-old leaving his shoes in the hallway. She sat down at the kitchen table. She folded her hands around her mug. She looked at the corkboard and all the things pinned to it, the ribbons and the letters and the drawings and the small card that said, "Thank you for the cornbread, even the burned kind." The house was quiet. The table was set. And she understood, sitting there in the morning light, that this was not an ending. This was what the whole thing had been for, not for this moment of quiet, though the quiet was good, for what came next. For what the 3 of them were going to do with the years ahead, with the things she had given them, the warm bowl and the turned earth and the library card and the hall light left on. She had not raised them to come back, she had raised them to go forward. But she had left the light on anyway, because you always leave the light on. The message came from Marcus first. He sent it at 11:17 on a Wednesday evening, and it said only, "I need to talk to you tomorrow," and it carried the particular weight of messages that say one thing and mean several others. Dorothea read it from her kitchen, standing in the same spot where she had read a great many important things over the years, and she replied, "Call me in the morning," and she set the phone down and finished her tea and went to bed, because she had always understood that worry is rarely improved by performing it in advance. She was 71. She had been, for the past few years, living the life of a woman who has done a great deal and is at peace with it. She still had the garden. She still made the stew. She had taken on 2 more short-term foster placements in the years since the boys had left, though the county had begun, gently, to suggest that she might consider whether the workload was appropriate for someone of her age, and she had received this suggestion with the same courteous noncompliance she had always brought to well-meaning advice she did not intend to follow. She had also, in the past year, received news from her doctor that she had chosen to keep to herself. It was not a small thing. The doctors had used serious words in measured tones, the way doctors do when they need you to understand something without panic. She had listened carefully, asked specific questions, and driven home alone. She told her pastor, she told no one else. It was not that she did not trust the boys. She trusted them completely, which was precisely why she had not told them. They had their own lives now, real and full, and still finding their shape. They did not need this weight. She had spent 12 years making sure they did not have to carry what was not theirs to carry, and she saw no reason to change the policy now. But Marcus had a contact at the hospital. She had not anticipated that. His call came at 7:45 in the morning, which meant he had been awake for some time. He said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who told you?" He said it did not matter who told him. He said he had called Caleb at 11 the previous night. She knew what that meant before he said the rest. He said, "We are coming on Friday." She said, "You do not need to do that." He said, "Dorothea." He had called her by her name perhaps 6 times in his life. She counted. It was the kind of thing she noticed. She said, "I am fine." He said, "We are coming on Friday, and we would like it very much if you were going to be there when we arrive." This was the closest Marcus had ever come to a joke at a serious moment. She recognized it as what it was, a lifeline extended in the shape of humor, the way he had always handled the things that mattered most to him. She said, "The table will be set." He said, "We know." She heard, in the way people hear things that are not technically audible, Caleb on the other end of Marcus's call, and Deshawn somewhere in the background of all of it, and she held the phone and stood in the kitchen where she had stood for 12 years of mornings, and she did not cry. She started cooking. They arrived on a Friday morning, all three of them, in separate cars from separate cities, pulling into her driveway within 20 minutes of each other as though they had coordinated it, which she suspected they had. She was at the kitchen window when the first car pulled up, and she watched them come toward the house, these men who had once been starving children, walking up her front path like they had somewhere to be. She had the door open before they knocked. Caleb was first up the steps. He was 31 now, tall in the way he had always been tall, but settled in it now, as though he had finally grown into the steadiness that had always been trying to be his. He had a small scar on his right hand from a construction site incident 2 years earlier that he had mentioned in passing in a phone call and she had thought about for weeks. He looked at her for a long moment, the way he had always looked at things he was taking the measure of, and then he stepped through the door and held her in a hug that was brief and firm, and said everything that Caleb had never been able to say with words. Marcus was behind him. Marcus at 30 had become, in some way she still found startling each time she saw him, exactly the person he had been trying to be at 9 years old, just with the patience to match. He was wearing clothes with soil on the knees because he had come directly from a work site, which told her that he had not stopped to change, which told her he had been driving for a while. He hugged her for a long time, both arms, and when he stepped back his eyes were bright in the way they always got when he was feeling something he was not going to name. Deshawn came in last. He was 29, and he had the same quality of stillness he had always had, that particular quiet that was not absence but attention. He had a bag with him and he set it down inside the door, and then he held her hands for a moment, both of hers in both of his, and looked at her, and did not say anything. She said, "Wash your hands, the stew is on." They washed their hands, they sat down. She filled the bowls the way she had always filled them, without asking how much, without checking, just filling, and they ate, and for a few minutes the only sounds were spoons and the low warmth of the kitchen and the oak tree outside doing what it had always done. Then Marcus said, "You should have told us." She said, "I know you believe that." He said, "We are not going to argue about it." She said, "Good, because the cornbread is not burned today, and I would like to enjoy it." Deshawn made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh. Caleb looked down at his bowl. Marcus looked at the ceiling for a moment the way he always did when he was releasing something he had decided not to fight. They stayed for 6 days. In those 6 days, they fixed the gutter on the north side of the house that she had been ignoring since November. They reorganized her medications in a way that she found both unnecessary and secretly useful. They argued twice about her diet, and she listened to both arguments with the patient expression of a woman who has no intention of changing her diet but values the fact that someone is paying attention. They worked in the garden, all three of them, on a Thursday morning when the weather turned warm, and she watched from the kitchen window and thought about a March afternoon many years ago when she had handed a 9-year-old a shovel. Caleb sat with her one evening while the other two were out getting groceries, and he told her about his current project, a series of pedestrian bridges for a rural county that had been dealing with seasonal flooding, 3 crossings over a river that rose every spring and cut off communities from each other and from services they needed. His firm was doing it pro bono. He had proposed it to his partners 2 years earlier, and he had not told her until now. She asked why. He said, "I wanted to be sure it was going to happen before I told you. I did not want to announce something and then not deliver." She thought about this. She said, "That is very like you." He said, "Is that a compliment?" She said, "It is a description. From me, those are usually the same thing." He looked at the corkboard, all 3 of them actually. He studied them for a while. Then he said, "You kept everything." She said, "Of course." He said, "Why of course?" She thought about how to answer this. She thought about the forms filled out at night and the caseworkers with their clipboards and the meetings she drove to alone and the phone calls at 2 in the morning and the 12 years of ironed tablecloths. She said, "Because everything was evidence. Evidence that you existed. Evidence that you were here. Evidence that this was real." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said it was very real. She said, "I know." Marcus had been spending his days, when he was not fixing gutters or managing her medications, on the phone. She heard pieces of conversations from the other rooms, his voice taking on the particular quality it had when he was working through something complicated with the specific patience he had developed over years of working through complicated things with people who were learning to trust him. On the fourth day, she found out why. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table in the early afternoon and said he had been making calls. He said he had been in contact with her county, with the agency, with the funding bodies. He said he had been making the case, using the specific and persuasive language of a man who had spent his career doing exactly this, for an expansion of support resources for long-term foster parents. He had, in the course of 4 days of phone calls, secured a commitment for a funded review of current support structures and a meeting scheduled for the following month between agency leadership and an advocacy group he worked with. He said this all in the direct, factual way he said things he cared about most, without decoration. She said, "Marcus." He said, "I know." She said, "You did not have to." He said, "I know that too." He looked at her. He said, "You showed me what it looks like when someone decides something matters and does not stop deciding. I have been doing that for 10 years. Some of it has gone toward the garden. Some of it has gone toward this." She thought about the 9-year-old in the dirt. She thought about the Tuesday afternoons she had watched him work in the community center garden with the small, solemn children who listened to him with everything they had. She said, "The work you do with those communities." He said, 342 families now have access to growing space through programs I have helped develop. He said it simply, not boasting, just counting, the way he had always counted things he could verify. She looked at him. She said, 342. He said, "And growing." Deshawn had been quieter than the other two, which was not unusual. He moved through the house the way he always had, present and attentive, leaving small things in his wake. A drawing left on the kitchen table, a note on her pillow, the photograph on the refrigerator adjusted by half an inch so that the morning light hit it better. On the 5th evening, he came and sat beside her in the living room and opened his bag. He took out a book and held it out to her. She took it. It was a published book, his name on the cover. She turned it over and read the back and looked at the image on the front, one of his drawings, a figure standing at the center of a page with lines radiating outward, steady against pressure. She recognized the drawing. She had seen it on her kitchen table a long time ago. She said, "This is the one you left for me." He said, "It is the title piece. I dedicated the series to you. The acknowledgments are on page 5. She found page 5. She read it. It said, "For Dorothea, who kept the light on and who understood that seeing someone clearly is the most important thing one person can do for another." She held the book for a while. She held it the way you hold things that have weight beyond their physical weight. She said, "You are extraordinary, Deshawn." He said, "You always said I was going to be something." She said, "I said it the way I say pass the salt." He said, "I know, that is why I believed it." On the last evening they all sat at the table after dinner, the dishes cleared, tea going around, and they were there together in the specific quality of silence that exists only between people who have lived in the same house and know each other's sounds, and do not need to perform the comfort they feel. Caleb said, "At some point, we would like to talk about coming back more often." She said, "You have your lives." Marcus said, "You are our life." He said it in the same matter-of-fact way he said true things that he had decided were not up for discussion. She looked at the three of them. She thought about a Thursday afternoon and a ringing phone and a tablecloth she had ironed twice. She thought about 3 grocery bags and 3 boys who had walked through her door and eaten with their eyes down, and the sound of spoons and the smell of stew. She thought about a shovel and a library card, and a lamp she had never liked and burned cornbread every Tuesday for a month. She thought about everything a person can build by simply deciding that something matters and not changing their mind. She said, "You know where the house is." Marcus said, "We know where the house is." She said, "The table is always set." Caleb said, "We know that too." Deshawn did not say anything. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the table for a moment, the same way he had once reached for the back of a jacket on the first day in a house he did not yet know was safe. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the kitchen window the garden was dark, but she knew every inch of it. She knew where the tomatoes were and where the herbs grew and where the soil was richest and where it still needed work and where Marcus had put his hands in the earth for the first time at 9 years old and discovered that the ground gives if you push hard enough. She knew every inch of this house, every light and shadow, every board that creaked and every window that stuck in July and every corner where she had stood and watched three boys become who they were always going to be. She had not done something remarkable. She had done something necessary. She had picked up the phone, she had kept the pot full, she had left the light on. And here at this table in this house, with these three men who had come back not because she had asked them to, but because they understood what the house meant and what she had meant in it, she felt the thing she had been feeling in small pieces for years gather into one clear and complete shape. She had given them a home. They had given her one back. The light was on in the hallway. It had been on for 12 years. She left it on that night too. She always would.